Good morning, veterans and patriots. This year, the Veterans Council of St. Johns County is remembering its veterans in a different way due to the restrictions on us from the COVID-19 assembly of large gatherings. The Veterans Council has chosen to produce a documentary to honor our veterans. My name is Bill Dudley, and I'm the chairman of the Veterans Council for St. Johns County. Over the years, the council has produced 5 documentaries honoring our veterans as well as our canines for warriors. Last year, the council hosted a program honoring our World War II military on D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. This year being the 70th anniversary of the invasion of South Korea by the North Korean Communists and the beginning of the Korean War, we are honoring our Korean War veterans as we continue to remember all of our veterans on November the 11th. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, due in part by the lack of public attention and coverage by the news services. Since Congress never officially declared war, President Truman referred to it as a police action. However, it was one of the most destructive wars in the modern era, and the loss of millions of lives involving civilians as well as those serving in uniform. This being the 70th year of the anniversary of the Korean War, the Veterans Council of St. Johns County has assembled 5 veterans that will be that served during this period to tell their stories of the Forgotten War, remembered.
The Korean War was the first military act of the Cold War. On June 25, 1950, a large North Korean army invaded the South and soon controlled most of the lower part of the Korean peninsula. Soviet leader Stalin not only approved the invasion, but provided substantial military and economic assistance to the North Korean chairman Kim Il-sung, including up-to-date Soviet motorized equipment, artillery, aircraft, and manpower. When informed of the invasion, U.S. President Truman ordered an emergency session of his military and foreign policy advisors, who decided South Korea had to be defended both for the sake of its people and because of its strategic position across the straits from Japan. President Truman ordered General Douglas MacArthur to counter the communist tide. He also asked for action by the United Nations Security Council. Truman placed the fighting in Korea in the broader context of the struggle between freedom and communist slavery. Under MacArthur's leadership, UN forces began a counteroffensive that by mid-November had brought its forces deep into North Korea and close to the Yalu River and the Chinese border. To MacArthur's surprise, the People's Republic of China launched a massive counterattack, sending 200,000 Chinese troops across the Yalu River against the now outnumbered American forces. Forced to retreat, the American army was once again below the 38th parallel. By mid-March 1951, with heavy reinforcements and naval command of both coasts and under a new field commander, General James Van Fleet, the U.S. UN Army recaptured Seoul and recovered South Korea to just above the 38th parallel, a return to the status quo before the North Korean invasion. Approximately 3 million people died in the Korean War, the majority of whom were civilians, making it perhaps the deadliest conflict of the Cold War era. U.S. military deaths were 37,000, with 7,600 missing in action. Armistice negotiations between North Korea and the United Nations began on July 10, 1951, and continued until March 1953, when the North Koreans finally agreed to an armed truce. No formal peace treaty has ever been signed, meaning that technically the war is not over and that a state of war still exists. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 is referred to as the Forgotten War.
Boyd, Morrison, Guttery, and was in Korea, and 223rd Infantry. Company F was infantry platoon leader, and was in the Punch Bowl. The name of the area of Korea where I was when the war ended, I was in the Punch Bowl, which was near Kumwa Valley, over on the east coast of Korea. I was there when the war ended in 1953. Went over in '52 and got to my platoon right after New Year's Day in '53, and joined there, and I had a notable company commander named David Hackworth, who became pretty famous for 104 medals and decorations he'd received and all, but at that time we were just 2 second lieutenants, and we were the only officers there. Well, I was a platoon leader, rifle platoon leader, and I had supposed to have 8 men in my squad and supposed to have 4 squads in my platoon, but we had a heavy weapons platoon, and we had so many people killed back then. We were so far under strength that most of the time, instead of my 30, 32 people, I would have maybe 15, 16 people total would be all I would have. We had citations from for combat losses, and also we had two unit citations from the Korean government.
Most difficult thing you think it was about being there, for you personally?
The weather. Mud. See, this was just a few years after World War II had ended, and so we were badly in need of current supplies. We didn't even have the current olive green shirts. We had olive drab shirts. We wore the same fatigues, and we had the same kind of boots, and also we didn't have any modern weapons, so we were undersupplied and underarmed. For being in the infantry, we were. In the winter though, the hardest thing was we'd be out and tears would freeze in our eyes, and we'd get frostbite in our fingertips, and there was just no relief for it. We had no place to go, no heavy equipment, and we stayed wet from the mud and all, and from the rain for long periods of time. Well, to tell you the truth, that was a good term, because we were a forgotten war. But it was so soon after World War II had ended, and the attitude in this country towards the military was so bad at that time that even when we left coming to Korea, we expected to be ignored, and we weren't disappointed. That's the way it was. Boyd, B-O-Y-D, Guttery, G-U-T-T-E-R-Y, and I was a first lieutenant when I resigned my commission.
My name is John E. Printi. I am a retired Chief Warrant Officer, U.S. Navy. We were there for the last 2 months of the war. At that time, I was an aviation ordnanceman second class. Arm and de-arm aircraft for and from combat strikes. I was on a carrier. I enlisted 1948. I went through the whole of World War II as a teenager and so forth, and so many of my friends were Navy, and I just did it because they did it. We were not fired on. However, the Navy determined that we were operating under combat conditions, and thusly they declared it as combat. That's the hardest I ever worked in my life. We had our squadron, I was in a fighter squadron, we were flying F-2H Banshees, and we had 16 airplanes. Each combat strike we would launch 8 aircraft. And those aircraft had to be loaded with whatever ordnance that the flight called for,
Plus we had 4 20mm cannon in the nose of each airplane. They carried 600 rounds of ammunition for them. It was just continual. I think I was averaging about 2 hours sleep a night. For those who were there, we'll never forget it. People back home, I think, a lot of them were so fed up with war. They'd gone through World War II, and then not too long afterwards, Korea broke out, and now they're going through Korea again. It had a tremendous effect on the people at home, more so than it did on the people that were in the actual fighting and in the war. I'll never forget. I can name every single man that I worked with. That's been now 70 some odd years or close to it. And we just developed a rapport that I've never experienced it again. Never. We lost 2 pilots and we lost 2 aircraft. One of our pilots, his name was Ensign Broyles. He was from Baltimore. And we lost him the day before the war ended.
Oh, wow.
He was on a combat strike. 4 aircraft made the run on the target, and only 3 aircraft came back. So he was shot down. The other one we lost was a flight deck crash, and he went into the water after launch and exploded when he hit the water. So, now, well, by the time the carrier got to the spot where the aircraft was in the water, there was nothing left. No, I retired in 1969.
Wow. So you stayed how long?
21 years. I guess I was just acclimated to that type of lifestyle, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. A lot of people complained, but I just stayed in because I liked it. My name is Donald F. Foy, and my rank in the U.S. Air Force was an Airman 2nd Class. No, I enlisted in a reserve outfit in Santa Monica, California, and we got activated, 1951. Well, it had a lower, actually a lot of guys were talking about Navy or Marines. The Marines had a 4-year enlistment. I think at that time, the Air Force had a 3-year enlistment. So it was a no-brainer. Nobody wanted to go into the Marines. And we didn't know we were going to get activated. We just thought we were in the reserve. Well, actually starting way back in Korea, I was a medic with the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing at Suwon, Korea, just south of Seoul, east of Incheon. Our mission of my base, which had F-80s and F-86s, was to fly interdiction over North Korea. And our F-80s would strafe anything that moved all the way up to the Yalu River, and our F-86s flew cover for them. Because of Truman's policy of containment, if they had an engagement with a MiG, they had to break off the engagement. But we used to pick up a lot of guys that got shot up, shot down, that bailed out in the LOC. We treated them at my base in Suwon. I was there for a full year. It was a year rotation. And when I came back, I went to college and got a commission in the U.S. Air Force through the ROTC, and then actually moved into the U.S. Public Health Service, transferred my commission from the Air Force to the U.S. Public Health Service.
So what were your duties when you were there?
Well, taking care of individuals who had been shot down and injured, and base personnel who were injured, and doing sick call every day. And
almost like a doctor, huh?
Well, yeah, we were actually paramedics. Yes, we got the Presidential Unit Citation, I think, at one time. And I have a ribbon for that, I think, someplace. I had to go up to Yeongdong-po one time to bring samples for the laboratory up there, and I needed some combat boots. All I had was the brogans that were issued to me when in basic training. So I walked in and the guy said, "Hey, pick out a pair of boots." There were combat boots laying in a pile up to the ceiling with pine boxes all around, waiting for guys to be shipped home, dead individuals who'd expired. And so I picked out a pair of combat boots. I had no idea whose they were, but they fit, and that was fine. And that was right after MacArthur landed, and all the guys that got up in the Chongqing Reservoir up there were Marines that were freezing to death because they were ill-prepared for the cold winter. Well, you know, as an individual having been there for a year, you'd never forget, and you remember. I think basically we didn't get the publicity that they did from Vietnam later on, and people just never thought much about it, and we just integrated ourselves back into society when we got back.
Was that difficult?
No, not for me it wasn't. I was in school, and I thought it was very interesting actually going through Treasure Island in San Francisco and being processed out of the Air Force at that point in time, and I never ate so much steak and ice cream in my life.
So did you retire from the military?
No, I didn't. I left government service basically I got involved in organized medicine. After my fellowship, I became a hospital administrator, if you will. Name is Donald F. Foy, and I left government service, the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps, as a lieutenant commander.
Okay, this is Dr. Henry L. Moreland. I was a buck sergeant when I left the country to go to Korea, and I came back a buck sergeant. Yeah.
What were your duties?
Flight operations at Marine Corps, 1st Marine Air Wing, MAG 12 at K3 at Pohang. And we kind of lived just like they did at MASH. We had tents and Quonset huts. Not allowed off base, really. And flight ops is, I briefed pilots, debriefed them. That's the tower, meteorology, all of that was flight operations, yes. I was there at the end of the war. I went through boot camp in '52. By the time I got orders, it was the end of the war. So I went over there for 13 months and came back and got out and went to college, yeah.
Why the Marine Corps?
My brother was in, and I was going to be drafted. And so I just went ahead.
Did he serve in Korea also?
Yes. As a matter of fact, he was there when he was coming back. I was going over.
Interesting.
And ironically, we ended up at K3 at the same place, but at different times, yeah. Right. We lost pilots for weather, parts and everything, but we were behind the lines, yeah. Okay. Combat zone, but behind the lines. Yeah. Just being there, the whole experience of the 13 months, seeing the Korean people, seeing the honey buckets and all of that, seeing the native Marine Corps Korean guys on base and how they were treated. It was an experience that prepares you for life. We saw, analyzed, adapted, and kept on going.
Did your unit receive any citation?
Yes, the presidential, the 1st Marine Air Wing, yeah. A MAG 12 did, yes. I feel that that's not true. Those who served, men and women from the 21 countries that ended there to stop the aggression of the communists, we were all in the boat, so it was not forgotten. But again, very little publicity. When we got off the ship in San Francisco, Treasure Island, there's a couple band members there, and we went to the barracks and got something to eat, and that Monday we were processed out and went to work or college. Well, I have 3 degrees. First one is math. It's master's and doctorates in psychology.
Do you remember anyone who sort of impacted you or impressed you while you were there?
Well, we have good friends, lifelong friends. That's a major part of it. But as far as who you admire, it's still the pilots. Their skill, sea air rescue, the guys with the helicopters, and it was primitive back then. And then the pilots using planes with parts made in World War II and coming back. So those were the guys that saw action. Those were the great guys, yes. Yeah. Dr. Henry L. Moreland, United States Marine Corps, and Buck Sargent.
Edwin O Sullivan. I left as a staff sergeant from the military after joining in 1951. I joined the infantry and was trained by the 47th Division in Camp Rocker, Alabama. When volunteering to go overseas, I was fortunately assigned to the Combat Engineers, the 45th Division, which was completely different than the infantry, very fortunately for me. No, I enlisted, RA 12334974. I had finished high school, and not knowing what to do, I joined the service to experience the effects or the enjoyment of joining the service. I like the service. I like rules and regulations. In the Combat Engineers, trained in the Army, Combat Engineers, and then in the Signal Corps for the last 6 or 7 months. I stayed 3 years. I was in the Combat Engineers, so I did see some combat, not on the front lines with the infantry, which I was trained for, but in driving from one location to another, we were regularly artillery shells coming on us and the like. Yeah. I think most everyone gives us a lot of credit. I don't look at it as forgotten war, and I don't think people do. The Korean government to this day still takes care of us and sends us vacations and whatnot, and has regular parties for us twice a year in Jacksonville. I did come home and go to school, became a French chef. In subsequent years, the Army recruited me and appointed me Brigadier General to travel around the world, inspection and training tours for 5-6 weeks. And subsequent to that, the Air Force recruited me in '83 to do the same thing. They appointed me Brigadier General to do the same training course that I did for the U.S. Army. I came from a family who came from Canada legally, and they were farmers by trade, and they were very strict parents. And I learned that it was continued that in the military, and I enjoyed being in those circumstances. Ed O Sullivan, U.S. Army, and I retired as a staff sergeant.
Okay, my name is Mike Del Pizzo, retired from the United States Air Force as an E7.
And why the Air Force?
That's an interesting story. I was going to look into the Navy, and then I spent a weekend on a USS Intrepid before it was decommissioned, because my sister's boyfriend was assigned there. And after spending a weekend on the ship, banging my shins and my head on the bulkheads, that was enough to convince me not to join the Navy, and I went Air Force.
So, what dates did you serve in Korea?
From August 1976 to August of 1977. The Korean War never technically ended. Technically, I'm a Korean War veteran. When I was there, I was an E2, an airman, just an airman. Aerospace ground equipment mechanic. I worked the mid-shift, and basically what we did is service all the aircraft equipment that was needed to keep the aircrafts going. And I have to tell you this, working the midnight shift in Korea was difficult, especially in the wintertime. I had to walk from the barracks all the way down to the flight line, and we kept the aircraft in the concrete revetments and in the elements, so it was tough. Yes, we were on alert all the time, but I do recall one incident while I was there. It was at night, and the maintenance munitions people were putting the cannon on the F Foy, and somehow the damn thing went off, and it blew the front landing gear right off the plane in the revetment.
Wow.
That was really quite something to see that.
Did anyone get hurt?
No, fortunately not. Nobody got hurt, but they ruined the airplane. I took some leave while I was there, and I got to know a couple of other GIs. We became really good friends, and we traveled throughout the throughout the country. But it was good. Traveling through the country, it gave me a feel of how those people lived. And I tell you what, it made me appreciate the United States that much more when I came back.
What was the hardest thing about you being in Korea? Is it loneliness? Loneliness,
yes. I'm in a foreign country, first time out of the continental U.S. I knew no one. I didn't know to speak the language, and that was tough to deal with.
You served about 20 years after the big conflict, the war itself.
Right.
So what are the topics of conversation when you run into those men who did, were in a whole different Korea in the 1950s?
We had some interesting conversations, especially when we went to the local restaurants that wasn't really a restaurant, but a place where you can get rice wine and so on. And then ladies were very friendly. They saw us come in, GIs, and they clung to us. Normally we had money, we'd buy them drinks, and you can imagine what went on from there.
Did you retire from the military?
I did. I spent 22 years, 1 month and 25 days on active duty.
Wow.
And I traveled all overseas. Michael James Del Pizzo, retired Air Force, E7.